As we head into the fourth quarter, the holidays around the corner, it is handbook season. So we wanted to talk about a few things today on what your next steps might be. Are we going to be okay with just this, annual update type culture, or hey, yeah, maybe we'll just do it every other year because we're somewhere in the middle of the country and things haven't really changed very much. Neither of those are going to be a recommendation moving forward. We have some great tools that we're going to jump into today. As always, Payentry is not a law firm. The presentation today is intended for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon in reaching a conclusion in a particular area of law. The things that we talk about today absolutely will change depending on where you're located geographically. There are also policies that that are determined by how many employees you have. So there's a lot of curveballs here. If you have any questions, please use the chat function, or at the very end, I will add our HR services email address, and you can always email us directly. We'll be glad to call you and answer those questions offline. A quick overview. Again, I'm Brett. I have my colleagues here in the HR services department. I've got Tony Rose joining us today. Tony is an HR professional in North Carolina. We have Jenna Lopez. Jenna is an HR professional out in Maryland. The three of us are the advisors on the front end on the sales operations side. So I wanted you to be able to put a face with a name. They will also be chiming in, talking throughout this presentation, answering some questions. So we'll start off with the role of the modern employee handbook, what to include, what to avoid, how we should align policies with culture and values, some compliance essentials. Tony will cover that. And then some of the functionality of the HR tools that we offer, right? How to roll these out, how to get the acknowledgments, and how to maintain this now moving forward, so that we can get out of this, annual or every other year update, and then you leave yourself open, for legal exposure because you don't necessarily have the correct policies. Again, Brett, Jenna, Tony. The modern employee handbook, right? So in my opinion, right, the employee handbook is probably right up there, 1A and 1B, alongside with, job descriptions are extremely important. But the employee handbook should be a document that is thorough, that it's also easy to understand, okay, and that it applies to all employees, right? A lot of misconceptions, a lot of missed opportunities that I see are these handbooks that are, close to 100 pages, that have all kinds of policies and procedures all smashed in together. That's not going to be the best idea, right? We want to simplify this as best as we can, but also make sure that it is 100% compliant for the states that we operate in and where we have our employees. Okay. For example, we have out here in Southern California, where I'm located, a lot of transportation companies, right? They've got truck drivers that drive in and out of California, up and down the state of California. And obviously, if you employ drivers, there are certain sets of rules that apply to them when they are in the company vehicle, when they are, how they're going to take their meal break, how they're going to take their rest breaks, how they're going to interact with their clients when they're making deliveries, or so on and so forth, right? That protocol doesn't necessarily apply to your payroll manager who's sitting upstairs in your corporate office, right? So if we have driver specific policies that don't apply to others, we shouldn't have those just then jammed in the back of page 62 on a handbook, right? The handbook should be all of the state and federal law that applies to everybody, from your CEO down to your newest hire. And then what we can do is, if there are certain driver protocols or protocols for outside sales reps, or for whatever industry you might be in, we would then create a separate document that would have all of those, and we could use some of the tools that Tony's going to talk to you about later on to be able to get that and message that to the employees, that you have your master company handbook, and then maybe if you're a driver, you have your driver handbook, or you have your sales protocol handbook on what we should be saying during phone calls and how we should be interacting with our clients. Okay. The cultural and compliance tool, kind of how this meshes, together, is that it's very important that you have a document that is correct, but that you also spend the time to make sure that it is written in a style that fits your workplace. Okay. A lot of times that I've been involved in mediation hearings, arbitration, actual, litigation, depositions, the main concern is situations where we may have just cut and pasted a document, or we went and downloaded one somewhere off of a website, or a friend of a friend let us borrow one, or it's kind of stale, it hasn't been updated in a long time. Okay. And we have these policies, but they are not congruent with how we are managing our day-to-day operation. Okay. And what a simple example would be like an attendance policy. Okay. I'll give you a fact pattern of a case that I was involved with last year. Okay. Smaller business. Okay. Let's say maybe 7 or 8 employees. Okay. 5 out of those 8 are relatives, right? It was like a little heating and air company, husband and wife started this heating and air company. Their adult children work for them. A niece and a nephew worked for them. So at the first few years, it was all just kind of family related in this business. Okay. And then what happened is they started growing, and they needed to now hire their first 2 people that were outside of the family, right? They needed an office manager that was, that could come in and keep everybody on task, that, they found, on Indeed or LinkedIn. And they wanted another technician that was maybe recommended by a friend of a friend, but again, not related to the ownership. So they go out and they hire these employees. Okay. And right off the bat, the newest technician is having some issues with attendance. Okay. Supposed to be there at 7:30 a.m. to be able to kind of clock in, get the company vehicle and start his routes to be able to visit all of their clients. Okay, but they notice, 7:32, 7:33, 7:34, guy comes in with a Starbucks one day, he comes in with a McDonald's the other day, and they're getting just very annoyed, right? And they end up terminating the guy. Okay, they terminated him for violations of the attendance policy, right? And sure enough, a couple weeks later, they get a complaint, wrongful termination. Okay, well, why is that? Well, the employee handbook says, okay, this employee handbook that they had downloaded off of some website or gotten for free at a Chamber of Commerce meeting or something like that, said, it was a very strict 3 strikes and you're out policy. It said, hey, the first time that you show up late, there's going to be a verbal warning, right? The second time it's going to be a written warning, right? Final written warning. And then the third time that you have this situation, it's going to be terminated. Okay. But that's not necessarily how they were managing, right? They didn't follow their 3-strike policy that was outlined in the handbook. Huge issue. Okay. Huge problem. The second problem is that all of the other family members, right? The brother and the uncle and the cousin, they got to come in whenever the heck they wanted. They were always 5-6 minutes late grabbing food and coffee and whatever. And the new hire didn't know because nobody told him. He just was doing what everybody else did. Well, hey, you know what? Tony comes in a few minutes late. Well, yeah, Tony's my son, right? I'm the owner. That's my son. He can do whatever he wants. No, you can't do that, right? If you're going to have a document that outlines company policies, it needs to be applied even-handedly across the board for all of your people. Okay, so what's the solution? Well, the solution here is spending some time and actually reading this document and customizing it to make it your own. Okay. So if you want to have different rules and regulations for some manager level employees, or if you want to have, maybe you want to lighten the language on the attendance because you're not going to start writing people up for showing up a minute late, well then, okay, then make it your own. Let's work together and figure out how to customize that language, how to make sure that your managers, your leadership knows exactly what's written in there, and it fits your culture, and you're able to then easily apply all of those rules so there's zero confusion. Because in that case, I think my memory is correct. I think they had to pay, I think it was about $12,000 they paid in a settlement, for the wrongful termination and discriminatory um, business practices. Okay, they figured they'd rather just settle it than continue to fight it, because it was clear that they had a stale handbook and they weren't necessarily managing according to the document. Right? Expensive lesson to learn. Right? We can spend pennies to the dollar there and work together on this, get it done correctly the first time, and give you a living, breathing document that we can maintain. Right? So that things like that would never happen. Okay. Um, Again, I just mentioned tailoring that content to the workforce and to your industry so that it makes sense. It's not just, cut and paste, because employees also nowadays, especially the younger demographic of the employee, they put a lot of weight into all of these documents. They actually read them. My whole career, I've been doing this for 15 years now. Very rarely do people actually spend the time to read through the handbook. Now, over the last, maybe 16 to 18 months, when I get involved in employee disputes, I've noticed a huge uptick in employees that actually know their rights. They know the company policies. They read them. They're telling me, Brett, this is wrong. It says on page 35. I had never heard that before. Right. So the takeaway is, look, especially if you are hiring younger employees, whether it's, high school, college students, people right out of college into their first job, we need to make sure that we have a tailored document that is maintained throughout the year, that anytime there's a change, that we are working together to figure out how to incorporate that so that we don't have any stale policies, because they're going to find them, they're going to call us out on it. And whether or not there's a legal issue, that's a whole separate story. But it's the HR issue, right? If we are trying to grow our business and we want to try to recruit and retain the best employees, these are things that kind of make us look small in the eyes of prospective employees. Or these are the kind of things that are avoidable, and now our best employees now are subject to being poached by competitors, that have these tools and have these documents all put together for themselves and aren't scrambling and kind of piecemealing things together, right? Um, Language to steer clear of. Obviously, we want to make sure that in the document, everything is professional, correct, right? That we're not using generalizations. The most common error that I see when it comes to language is the misapplying policies, especially if you have employees in different states. Okay, there are sometimes conflicting leave of absence. There are conflicting laws and conflicting policies. So it's best in that situation that we work together to figure out how to combine those things, how to make sure that it's drafted clearly so that you don't have two conflicting policies in there that are causing confusion to the employee, especially around a leave of absence, right? Because if our document's incorrect, then a court is going to say, well, you know what? You had it in your handbook, so now we're stuck because what we should have only given Jenna a 30-day leave. We now are obligated to hold her position for 60 days because we screwed up and it was unclear as to which policy governed in that situation. Just easy mistakes to avoid, right? We can avoid that stuff, so it should never happen. We should never be in that situation. Okay. Making sure that we are aligning our policies with our culture and our values. Again, I think this is probably the biggest change that I'm seeing, kind of in the HR sphere right now, is taking the kind of boring boilerplate state and federal law and figuring out how to redraft it so that obviously we have the law, we have it correct, but we have practical policies. Okay. If you see something, say something is a very practical policy. It's an easy example. Okay. What I don't need is we don't need to have 10 pages on complaint procedure and harassment prevention and all of these things. And we're just regurgitating the statutes inside of the handbook. These employees are like, what exactly does this mean? Okay. Let's talk about, well, practical, right? I was conducting a training last week with one of our clients, had asked us for some harassment prevention training. Okay. And we started off and I was kind of just assisting their HR manager. And the HR manager, was doing the best she could. And she was on there and clearly just kind of a little nervous and just reading all the stuff off of the California Department of Industrial Relation website, the black letter law as to what this means. And I said, hey, you know what? I appreciate that because you're correct, but your people, that are watching this training, they're just kind of, eyes glazed over. They're just staring off. You can see they're on DoorDash ordering some lunch or whatnot. They're not engaged because you're not talking about practical issues, right? You're spending all of your time talking about, quid pro quo harassment and all these things that are most commonly found in an office type setting. Okay. Not that it can't happen in a virtual environment, it can, right? But you're talking about touching employees and, sleeping with your supervisors and all that kind of stuff. Okay. But all of your employees, all of the people that we're talking to are remote. So we should probably let's figure out how to make this practical, and let's figure out how to address them specifically, right? So that's what we're going to do in this handbook, right? We're going to take that into consideration. Do you have a physical location? Is everybody remote? Is it hybrid? Okay. What state are they in? How do we kind of meet them where they are? So in my training example, I said it's more likely, right, that you have your outside sales reps and they are going to, networking events. So I said, let's use a real life example. Okay. I know tonight I've got a couple of clients already talking to me tonight about it is right. NBA, the NBA is back tonight. I'm in Southern California. Everybody around me has their Los Angeles Lakers gear on. Certainly not me, but everybody else, right? And I said, that's a perfect example. Okay. You're going to send these sales reps to the Lakers game tonight, and they're going to be, spending time with your clients. Okay. They need to understand that these harassment policies also apply to vendors and clients and partners and everything. Okay, so if they're in a situation to where somebody says something at this event or somebody does something at this event, then we need to know about it, right? A report needs to be filed. Okay, their manager lives like for me, right? I'm in California. Tony's in North Carolina. Tony and I might interact face to face once per year. Okay, I'm not really going to be, putting my hands on them, right? But let's figure out if that's the dynamic, how to take the law and make it more practical with what's going on under your roof so that people will actually know that you spent time dialing it in and they will actually spend time reading it and following our processes. Tony, if you wanted to jump in here and talk about some of the compliance essentials.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when we kind of look at the bare minimum for where we want to be, right? Federal, state, local laws, it's a very easy threshold. It's based on where you're at, where you have your employees. If you're not meeting that minimum threshold, we've got to talk about that. The same with some of these other laws, EEO compliance, FMLA. There's various wage and hour compliances that the Department of Labor has out there. They all kind of depend on your unique situation. You look at something that's boilerplate, you look at something that you borrowed from someone else, you're going to get into some issues where what you have might not even be applicable to what you've got, to what the business realities that you're facing are. Talking about the risky or outdated language, this kind of falls into that same area, right? If we are using old words, old terminology, referencing old laws, that's going to be an easy thing for an attorney, for an auditor, whoever it happens to be, to zero in on a potential leak and a vector for potential litigation or some other type of action, right? In the instance of a lawsuit, a sneaky or good lawyer might identify that and position that as your whole compliance, your whole handbook could be questioned now. And whether or not that's successful would be up to the court. But now you have to pay for an attorney to defend that, or you have to settle it because you don't want to deal with that. So having that proper language could just avoid that on the front end. The same with an auditor, right? You've got the DHS shows up to do an E-Verify audit and gets a look at your handbook. Somehow they notice something that's out of date, out of reference. They turn it over to the Department of Labor, and all of a sudden you've got all sorts of investigators showing up. That's kind of how those things happen. Once one organization gets in, they tend to let each other know if they see the lowest of hanging fruit, and you end up with a dog pile of government agencies on you before you even are aware of it. Another area to kind of think at, I know that Brett's talked about it a lot, is multi-state compliance. If you've got employees in multiple states, you've got locations in multiple states, the compliance is ratcheted up significantly. I'll give a lot of business owners credit, business leaders credit. They typically are somewhat aware of the HR laws that affect them in their local area. When you start moving into other localities, there's no chance. Even a seasoned HR professional could really struggle with this. If you're talking about being in 3, 4, 5, 10 plus states, right? The complexity just gets very ratcheted up very quickly.
Yeah, I think one thing, Tony, when it comes to multi-state, right, and then also kind of going back to that previous slide when we're talking about wage and hour and payroll type issues, that's where we usually see a lot of the mistakes, right, that we uncover, is that there's some confusion. Okay, like even a simple example. Okay, let's just say Tony, he's in North Carolina, but I ask him to go to down to Georgia, next week, for a training. Okay, well, what's the threshold, right? How do we know? Do different states have different thresholds? Even though he performs majority of his work in North Carolina, are there Georgia rules that I need to pay attention to? Again, from a tax withholding standpoint, no, but from specific employment law regulations and how we would manage things, the answer is yes, perhaps there are, right? Some municipalities, right, the city of Los Angeles, out here where I am, has a bunch of these curveballs that cause our clients fits every week, right? The rule out here is that if one of my employees were to spend at least 2 hours in a work week somewhere within the Los Angeles city limits, then I'm subject to their policies, which is a higher minimum wage in the state of California, which is more sick pay than the state of California, and so on and so forth. So these are all things that are very easy to kind of research. But then when you have all of this on your plate is, okay, well, how does this work? What, practically, right? How do we manage this? Okay, so that we don't make a mess, right? And that's what we are good at, is not only just pointing it out to you and say, hey, you might want to be aware of all these things, okay, but then having the conversation, the education piece, like, all right, this is everything that we have here in our sandbox. How are we going to rebuild it now so that it's easy for your employees to understand and read? Okay, everybody feels supported, everybody feels that we are doing the best that we can to comply, and we don't have any issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of building off that, just the ability to make sure that we're providing those handbooks in the right format, right? If you are in a border state, if you have a large whatever language it happens to be, workforce, providing that handbook in that language is, preferable for numerous reasons, and practical from something that we can do with our tools. We can easily recreate a Spanish translation for all of your handbook documents and get that so that they're always in line, and there's no extra step. Our software and tools can easily allow that to be done.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, I think that's a important. That's another one as I look back, on some of the issues that we've dealt with together over the past few years is, translated documents, right? Some states have different rules when it comes to translated documents, but I think the rule of thumb, right, that if you followed, you'd never be wrong, is if you have one employee that prefers to read in a language other than English, right? Not, well, all my employees speak English. That's not what I said, right? That's not the threshold, right? You might have people that, that are employed by you where English is a second language, and they might not be, very proficient at reading English, especially when we're talking about, employment practices, and handbook stuff. So if the expectation is that you're going to be enforcing these policies and you expect compliance, then, that's something that we should we should consider together and figure out. We can kind of conduct an analysis and figure out how to support you there. Because again, I tell these stories because I've lived them. I've sat there, in these depositions, and it's, hey, judge, Mr. Strauss here, doesn't speak English, doesn't read very well. Speaks English, but this is his second language. He doesn't read it very well. He had no idea that he was violating company policy. Okay. And again, these cases are not worth a tremendous amount of money. Okay. But the cost of defense now nationwide is through the roof. Okay. With all of the uncertainty going on, right? The economic uncertainty and all the other changes, litigation is more expensive now than ever, and these plaintiffs' attorneys know that. So even if it's a silly fact pattern, right? Attendance policy violations, repeated mistakes and errors, or whatever, an attorney knows that he can throw this at the wall and make some money, right? Because you don't really have a choice. If you want to hire an attorney, it's going to be, $7,500, $10,000 retainer. So they're just going to ask you for a little bit less than that. So you've got, theoretically no choice but to pay. It's how the game is played, especially out here in Southern California. So again, spending, a few $100s on a handbook and then having that translated is a smart investment, in my opinion, right? Considering what might be coming your way if we kind of overlook that when we should have paid more attention.
Absolutely. And the same with just borrowing from a friend, right? You're getting a generic resource, you're getting a generic handbook, you're getting generic answers. They're not customized to you. They might not be applicable at all. They could be at a point where, what you're getting will put you in more legal exposure, or what you're saying could put you in more legal exposure than, if you just hadn't had anything at all, right? So, making sure that what you're having your handbook, your employees attest to being the employee handbook should be accurate to your business circumstances. Whether that's something that our team can help you with, or that's something that you can do on your own, that's absolutely something you should invest the time and the resources in getting done. So when we talk about, how do we roll this thing out, right? So we've got it done. We've got a nice new polished up to date handbook. What do we do? So there's two interactions when you want to capture a handbook: signature or acknowledgement from the employee. That's an onboarding. You want that employee to review the handbook, know what the expectations are of them and all of their other employees, as Brett's kind of talked about. what is the expectation for an employee here at Payentry? What is the expectation for, me to, from an attendance standpoint? How much PTO will I get? Should all be in there. And presenting that in the onboarding process is key to helping that employee understand all that and, hopefully avoid some of the questions. Having been in HR long enough, I know that even if we send it to them, and as Brett talked about, most folks don't read it, so you're still going to have to answer questions on it, right? There, and you're just going to say it's right there in the handbook. It's page 7. Just turn to it, glowing and flashing. But I have to echo the sentiment that there does seem to be a tide that's turning in terms of people reading handbooks. And I think a lot of that has to do with companies making it easier to get them, getting them in the onboarding process and providing them early to let an employee read it and really acknowledge it and understand it and ask questions about it, as they're going through that onboarding. It is crucial. How do I do it? Is there a paper process? Is there a digital process? The right answer is what works for you. I would recommend almost always looking at a digital process. A paper process is going to create more work for you, for the employee, for everyone. It's going to present your company as antiquated in today's systems where digital signing isn't as revolutionary as it used to be. We have great tools that we can help you do this in both the onboarding setup and other ways. And then the other kind of time you want to get your employees to acknowledge the handbook is in an annual update situation. So once we've got that annual update, how do we manage this? Same question, right? Do I have to email it and then print a signature page and then have the people email it in? I save it as their name, and then I have to file it and keep track of it. That sounds like a lot of work. There's digital tools. We create it. We upload the list of people, of your employees, and it sends it out, and it's right there. And kind of circling back to that multi-state compliance, I think one thing that we didn't really talk about is the efficiency that it can drive for you as business owners or HR professionals, right? If you are in a state with 5, 10, 15, whatever it happens to be, like I mentioned, that complexity starts getting higher and higher and ratcheted up. I went through that in a previous role, hiring through the pandemic. We shifted our strategy from, located here in North Carolina to everywhere. We went from 3 or 4 states to all of a sudden being in 16 or 17. And I was doing good just to register for tax accounts in a timely manner to make sure our payroll company wasn't howling at me too bad. When it came time to do a handbook, I had no idea that some of these tools existed out there. And the process was very tedious. It was time consuming. And, I think I ended up spending over a week on it. If I would have had the tools, the resources, the ability to interact with our team here, that timeline would have been trimmed down significantly. Where my engagement now is, you're talking about half a day or a day to get a compliant multi-state handbook that I know I can rely on. That is some efficiency that you just can't really put a price on. Well, I guess you can, in your sanity and in your time, right? But I think that's something that I definitely wanted to circle back on.
Yeah, that's a good point, Tony. And what I was alluding to at the beginning of our call before we get into questions here is the software that we utilize in our HR system, right? It has a real-time update mechanism that is built in, right? So we'll spend the time to draft this document, to build it with you, customize it, make sure that it's correct for all states that you might have employees in, okay? And then what'll happen from there is every time there is an update in any of those locations, right, you will receive a message on your dashboard. Hey, Brett, just so you know, you told us last year that you have an employee that lives and works, in Chicago, Illinois. So just be aware that two things are changing effective January 1st of 26. The state of Illinois has this policy here, okay? But the city of Chicago also has this policy. So be that as it may, how do you want us to proceed now, Brett? And we'll look at that together and say, you know what? Yeah, those changes need to be incorporated into your Illinois section that we have in your handbook. So click OK, and then what happens now is the software then will add that new language, right, to replace the outdated language, and then you can simply use the software then to send an update to everybody. Hey, Payentry employees, did you know that there's been an update here? Please sign off electronically. So we're doing it on the fly and not necessarily letting things pile up and having to say, oh my goodness, it's just finished Thanksgiving, the holidays are coming, and now I have to get the handbook, and oh my goodness, and how am I going to get this rolled out by January 1st? Right? It's a lot, right? So if we can help you get into the digital environment, right? Not only are we going to get, we'll be able to give you that guarantee that everything that you have is correct, but it gets rid of this whole, annual update in the, oh my goodness, this huge undertaking where we have to pull all these things out and make all these changes. We're simply just doing it on the fly, and it's so much easier that way.
And even if you did want to just do it all at once, the system would still make it not overwhelming. It would let you do it in an organized manner and manage that annually if that was how you chose to do it, right? Like the system is very flexible and can let you work how you want to work.
Excellent. Dina, do we have any questions?
Tony is asking if the handbook was written last year for 2025, is it still current? I'm in the state of Virginia.
That is a great question. I don't know off the top of my head if there are any Virginia specific laws that have changed, but that's something that we can absolutely dig into. If you want to send us an email, Tony, at that HR services address, we will do some preliminary homework. We'll reply back to you and let you know, yes, you're good to go, or no, you need to make some adjustments.
Thank you, Brett. Our third question comes from Alana, and Alana is asking, do you need a handbook even if you have no full-time employees?
Yes.
Go ahead, Tony, take that one.
Yes, you definitely do. Even if they're part-time, if they're working in an employment arrangement and they're, that classification doesn't really matter so much. Maybe some of the benefits and things, but the compliance issues are still there from whether they're a full-time or part-time employee. Just what the content in there would be slightly different. And once again, being able to talk to a team like ours will dive right in there and figure out exactly what you need, what you don't need, so you don't have a bloated or unrelated sections in there.
Thank you, Tony. Our next question comes from Al. Al is sharing with us that he has a business in California, is in the process of expanding a franchise to Hawaii. Well, congratulations, Al. That sounds so nice. Can his California handbook cover the, I think what he's asking is will it work for Hawaii as well?
Yeah, the answer to that is going to be no. It might be 80%, similar, right? But there are going to be some policies that the state of Hawaii is going to expect that you follow and that are different from California. That's the legal answer to your question, but you also have the HR answer to your question. So this I think is the one that often gets overlooked. So I'll give you a perfect example, right? And again, this is just an example. Don't hold this against me if it's not correct. I'm just making these numbers up. Okay, let's just say your California handbook has a sick policy where everybody's getting 40 hours of sick because that's the law in California. Okay, And now let's say that you go to Hawaii and Hawaii does not have any sick pay legislation. Okay. So what would happen is if you use the California book in Hawaii, you're now giving all of those employees in Hawaii an extra 40 hours of pay that you don't have to. Okay. You might be okay with that. I say, yeah, Brett, that's my intention. I don't have any issue with that. No problem. I can, we budgeted for that. We'll give those employees sick pay, even though we don't have to, right? Or the other side, right? You might, we might go through this process and you might now have, whether it's vacation or other issues that come up or leaves of absence to where, you're giving it to some employees in California and you're not giving something to employees in Hawaii. And those employees might talk to each other and find out that you're not treating them all the same, and they might become very upset. So there's a lot of this back and forth, and how do we implement these policies? So I wouldn't just take the California book and bring it to Hawaii. You could legally. I don't think you'd have very many issues. It's just not going to be what I would recommend. I think it's people that have done that in the past. It's been sustainable for a short-term, period, and then you inevitably start bumping into issues and they start rearing their head, and it's so much harder than then work backwards and fix it once the cat is out of the bag. It's a lot easier just to take that California book, let us comb through it, let us plug in the Hawaii policy so you have both, and then that way you are ready to go.
So one last question. This is from Julie. What is the fee to have you review our handbook?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a few different service levels that we offer. Okay. To create a brand new handbook, to review a handbook and work together on creating a brand new customized handbook for you moving forward, assuming that's one state and one language. The fee for that is about $800 as a one-time fee for a brand new book. We also have different levels of HR support that include the brand new handbook. So a lot of the time we just go through this, we have a conversation, we figure out. Some of our clients will say, well, instead of paying the one-time fee, if it's just a little bit more, annually, and then I can have access to, you guys, Brett, asking questions whenever I need help. I can get into the HR database, and I can get, performance review documents and job descriptions and all these things. And, there's a phone a friend mechanism. So whenever an issue comes up, I can talk to a certified HR professional unlimited. I'd rather pay a little bit more and get all of that stuff than just go, a la carte with the handbook. And so there's a lot of different options. It's not one size fits all, but I'd love to be able to talk with you, Tony and Jenna. That's what the three of us do every day, is have these conversations, figure out. It also sometimes depends on how many employees you have. So if you send us that information, we can certainly send you back a proposal and see if there's a way that we can support you. One more time, here's that email address. So if you had something and I wasn't able to address it directly today, just send me an email, and you have our commitment that, whether it's later today or tomorrow, Brett, Tony, or Jenna will be reaching out to you so we can answer your question.